You are listening to the I Choose My Best Life podcast with Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith, a show that is dedicated to helping you live fully, love boldly, and rest intentionally. For additional resources, visit ichoosemybestlife.com.
Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Saundra, and you're listening to I Choose My Best Life. Today, we're going to be talking about our kids and how do we help them approach critically the different things that are happening in the world, looking at current events, news, all the things that are probably happening right in their own schools, so that they have a way of responding biblically and understand how these events relate to who they are and their identity in Christ. And I have joining me today Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and she has a book titled Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design, 40 Questions with Answers on Sexuality and Gender. I want to make sure we have a chance to go deeper into this because I think for a lot of people, when this conversation comes around, where I know for myself, I've always, when I'm thinking about sexuality and gender as it relates to my children who now are 21 and 19, my thinking was, oh, I should probably wait till they're like, I don't know, 12, 15, I don't know, some older age, like junior high, high school, before I begin. But in looking at your book and your research and the way you approach this within your organization, that's not exactly accurate, is it?
No, actually, usually when people ask me the question, when should I begin this conversation? And I tell them what I recommend, there's usually like this collective intake of breath. And so I say, wait, just give me a minute and let me explain. And so I recommend that rather than thinking of it as having the talk, that we think of it as having an ongoing conversation, many talks with our children. And I recommend that parents have the first of many biblically based sexuality talks with their children starting around the age of 4. Which I know that is so much younger than we're typically used to thinking.
Never crossed my mind at 4 when they're that age.
Yes, and there's 2 main reasons why I recommend this young age. The first is just what is known as the founder's effect, and it is just this psychological phenomenon that whoever is the first person to talk with us about a topic naturally becomes the expert in our minds on that topic. I just experienced this a few months ago that my car started making a funny sound. And I was thinking like, oh, is it just getting older or is something wrong? Do I need to take it into the shop? And so I texted a friend and I said, hey, can I swing by your house tonight with my car and have your husband take a look at it? And she's like, sure, stop on by. So swung by their house and her husband came out of the door and he said, Elizabeth, I am happy to take a look at your car, but why are you asking me to do this? I know nothing about cars. And I kind of started to chuckle and I was like, that's a good question. Like, why am I asking you to help me with this? And I realized that the first month that I had moved to the city where I now live, I got a flat tire in the middle of driving. I knew no one. My friend's husband came to my rescue. He changed the tire and then pointed me to a garage where I could get a permanent replacement of the tire. And so now in my mind, in our city, he's the expert on all things cars simply because he was the first person to talk with me about things related to auto mechanics. And it's similar with our kids. Whoever is the first person to introduce them to the concept of sexuality, whether that person is a friend, a teacher, a mentor, a cartoon character, an Instagram influencer, that person is subconsciously going to become the expert in our children's mind on all things sexuality. So therefore, whatever we say is then going to get filtered against what that other person has to say. So we want to make sure that our children are coming to us with their questions, their concerns, their curiosities, their fears. And so in order for that to happen consistently, we have to make sure that we're the ones who introduce the topic to them. The second reason that it's so important is, Dr. Saundra, we know that we live in a world that's very aggressively promoting ideas about sexuality and gender to children at very young ages. And these ideas don't align with God's design. So if we wait until our children have been exposed to something, whether it's, just through a cartoon character or just walking out in the neighborhood, and we have to therefore explain to them how what they just saw doesn't align with God's good design, if we haven't had the first conversation, we have to backtrack and start explaining how this doesn't align with God's good design before they even know what God's design is. So I'm not recommending that we sit down and have every single possible conversation with a 4-year-old, but that we at least introduce the topic around the age of 4 so that we establish ourselves as the experts so our children will come to us, and to make sure that their first understanding of sexuality is about the goodness of God's design.
So, what should that conversation include then for this 4-year-old, or this really 4-year-old is not even elementary? We're talking pre-K before they even have hit the schools, which I love that, because it actually enters in such an early age when oftentimes, even if they're going to like daycare or preschool, there's not a lot of teaching that's happening around those kind of topics often yet. And so it's such an early introduction. But what do you say? Like, where should the conversation be focused around? I can't imagine it's focused around the sexuality part, but I may be wrong, but maybe the gender aspect of it?
That's a really good question. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about the goal of your podcast, is that you're really like boots on the ground. Let's get practical. How do we do this? And so I recommend that parents have 3 foundational conversations at different times. And these don't need to be big sit down, like, okay, I'm going to talk with you about something important now. These can be conversations that you have, while you're driving your child to soccer practice, when you're sitting on the living room floor playing Legos, when you're baking cookies together. Just open up these conversations. And I recommend that the 3 conversations be: the first one, just the basic difference between what it means to be a girl and what it means to be a boy. The second one is the basic mechanics of sex. And the third one is the basics of reproduction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through and model the language that parents can actually use having these conversations. So just as a forewarning for anyone who is listening to this podcast right now with children around, if you don't want them to hear this yet, you want to be the one to introduce it to them, just put the pause button on and then pick it back up when your children are not around. So the first conversation is the basic difference between males and females. So I recommend you open the conversation by asking your child what their favorite toy is, or their most special toy. And then talk about how they treat that toy differently than they treat every other toy. Maybe they keep it up on a high shelf so that their younger siblings can't reach it. Maybe they leave it in their room when company comes over so that no other children play with it. Maybe they always keep that toy inside so that it doesn't get outside or get lost or get dirty. And then say, just as we have special toys that we treat with special care, God has given us special body parts that we're to treat with care. And this is where you're going to want to explain the anatomically correct terms. So I'm going to use the language right now. So if you have a daughter, you can say the special part of your body that God has given you is called your vagina. And then you explain the anatomically correct term for the opposite sex and say the special part of a boy's body is called his penis. And then explain that these parts of our body are so special that no one should look at or touch these parts of your body unless your dad and I, or your mom and I are caring for you, or a doctor is examining you to make sure that you're healthy. And then say, these parts of your body are so special that when we're in public, if you need to tell me something about this part of your body, you can just call it your private part, because it's a part of your body that we keep private. And so there you've just explained this is the difference between a boy and a girl. And then you can ask your child if they have any questions. Now, this is the part that sometimes really intimidates parents, because they think, oh my goodness, like what if my child asks me something, completely off the wall or inappropriate, or I don't know how to respond. And that's where I say it's just important to go in these conversations with your poker face on, a really pleasant poker face. And no matter what your child asks you, if you don't know how to answer it, just say, I am so grateful that God has given you a mind that thinks well. You are so smart. And say, I'm going to need a little bit more time to think about your question before I answer it. But you know what? Tomorrow after dinner, we'll come back and we'll finish this conversation. Then you've just bought yourself 24 more hours to think through the question, pray through it, talk to your spouse, talk to a trusted friend or mentor. Then the second conversation, and this conversation is for another day. We don't want to overwhelm our children with too much information. So that's just the gender conversation for one day. Another day, you're going to want to introduce just the very, very basics of sex. And so I recommend starting off the conversation by asking your child if they've ever made a promise. Now, at 4 or 5 or 6 years old, your child may never have made a promise before. And if they haven't, talk about a promise that you have made to them. Do you remember that I told you last Saturday that if you cleaned up your room, then we could go to the park? That was a promise I made to you, that I would take you to the park if you cleaned up your room. Or do you remember I promised that when I got back from that business trip, I would bring you a special treat? And then say, did you know that marriage is a promise? And you can say, that's right. When a man and a woman get married, they make a promise to God and to one another that they're going to love one another and care for one another in a way that they don't love or care for anyone else, and that they're going to be married for as long as they both are alive. Then you can explain, sometimes when people make a promise to show that they're serious about keeping that promise, they might do something with their bodies, like they might shake hands or they might lock pinkies. Or you can explain that when you purchase your home, you had to sign a whole bunch of papers saying that you were promising to pay for that house. And you can say, well, God has given a special act to confirm the promise of marriage. And that is called sex. Now, this is the most uncomfortable part of the conversation. But again, you want to keep that pleasant poker face on and just explain it very briefly. And you can say, sex is when a man places his penis inside of a woman's vagina. And you can say, this is the act that God has given the husband and wife to enjoy one another and remind one another of the promise that they've made to love one another and care for one another. And then you can explain, similar to how you did with body parts, that sex is a special act, so it's not something that they're going to be talking about with other people. That if they have any questions about it, they can come to you, but they're not going to be talking about it with their friends or with other people or adults. Again, ask if they have any questions, and if they shock you or surprise you, keep that poker face on by yourself 24 more hours. Then the third conversation, again, at another time, is the very, very basics of reproduction. And so for this conversation, I recommend you take your kids on a walk through the neighborhood and just notice all of the plants that are growing, the beautiful flowers and bushes and trees, and then say, do you know how these plants got started? And then explain that when a seed was planted in the ground, it received sunlight and water, and eventually it grew into this beautiful plant. And you can explain that God has created our bodies with something similar to seeds. And you can explain that boys' bodies are created with something similar to seeds that are called sperm, and women's bodies are created with something similar to seeds that are called eggs. And now you can clarify, this is not like a chicken egg. It's very, very tiny. And you can say that when a man's sperm meets a woman's egg, a baby begins to grow inside of a mother. And you can say, we've seen lots of women who have babies growing inside of them. Then you can explain, you may have wondered how the baby got there. Well, the way a baby gets there is through the of sex that God has given to a husband and a wife, that when a husband places his penis inside of a wife's vagina, that his penis releases some sperm. And if those sperm connect with her egg, a baby begins to grow. And again, you can ask your child if they have any questions, reiterate that this is something that's special. It's a gift from God. And because it's special, it's something that we're not going to be talking about with other people, but they can always come to you with their questions. So I hope that those are just 3 really very practical conversations that parents can have with their children.
No, I love that. And I love the practicality of that, because when you say 4 years old, my brain's thinking, oh my goodness, how do you even begin to enter the conversation? But I can see, even as you were mentioning the conversation on sex and the conversation on where babies come from, how easy that conversation could be if you're about to have another child, or a family member shows up pregnant and they're like, why is Aunt Jenny's belly so big? We're like, oh, leave Aunt Jenny alone. So, she ate too many tacos. So it's one of those things where instead of like coming up with cute ways of like brushing the topic off, we can actually take it as an opportunity to go into it, and even find ways, as you mentioned, like plants or other ways of making it so it's really relatable to the child, even at a young age. What would you say for parents who are a little bit anxious about the thought? Because I remember my husband and myself, like I said, our kids were quite older before we had the talk. But it was nerve-wracking as parents. It's like, what do we say? How do we share, all of this stuff? How can parents kind of build up their confidence and decrease some of the anxiety going into these conversations?
Yes, that is such an important question to ask, because you're right. It is just naturally fear-inducing to think about having these really big conversations with our children. Now, one important thing to remember is if you start these conversations with your child when they're under the age of 7, there's only one person in the equation who's going to feel any sense of awkwardness, and that's you as the adult. So that's a huge benefit of starting these conversations older. Once our kids are like 8 or 9, then we feel uncomfortable having these conversations. Our children feel uncomfortable having these conversations. And it's just, it's not impossible, and it's important to navigate, but it is just trickier. So what I encourage parents to think through first is to identify what specifically their fear is. Because in order to address a fear appropriately, we first have to understand what that fear is. So to ask yourself, what am I scared of? Am I just scared of talking about the topic of sex? Like, does it just make me uncomfortable? Because that might be a clue for us that we need to go back to scripture and make sure that we have a biblical understanding of sex. Because now, have humans found a million ways to corrupt God's good design for sex? Absolutely, we have. However, at its base, what God has designed is good. And so we need to make sure that we ourselves have a biblical understanding of this. And then after that, maybe another fear is, well, I just fear that I'm not going to have the right words and I'm going to mess this conversation up. Well, if you're scared you're not going to have the right words, then think through ahead of time. Maybe go back and re-listen to what I just mentioned on this podcast, and get that language down and, make sure you're prepared for that. And then also remember, one of the amazing things about being a parent is you don't have just one day with your child. You have the rest of your life in your relationship with them as a parent. So if you have a conversation and it goes terribly, that's okay. Because what you do is a few days later say, you know what, do you remember when I talked with you about this a few days ago? I did not do a good job, and there were some things I need to do a better job explaining. So can you give me a second chance, please? Because you have all of the time, that you have with your child. And so don't fear that if you mess it up, it's your one shot, because it's not. You can come back, you can circle back, and rehab the conversation. And then I think it's also important just to understand, like you said, that we are naturally going to feel some sense of shame or awkwardness. And scripture makes clear why this is. Right in the opening chapters of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 2, God creates Eve out of Adam's rib and brings her to him, and the two are united in marriage. And the closing verse in that chapter says, and the man and his wife were naked and were not ashamed. And so in their perfected state, with everything as God had created it, there was no shame in Adam and Eve's vulnerability with one another and what God had created for them. Where then in Genesis chapter 3, that's the narrative of Adam and Eve's rebellion against God and their fall into sin. And immediately after we're told that Eve eats the fruit and Adam eats it as well, it says, and the eyes of both of them were opened. They realized they were naked and they made coverings for themselves. And so when sin entered the world, all of a sudden, this vulnerability was no longer a safe vulnerability. It was a vulnerability that came with a lot of risk. And so it's because we are living in this fallen state that we do naturally feel some sense of anxiety and shame over talking about something so intimate. So I think if we can identify those fears, make sure we're addressing them, if we can remember that this is not a one and done deal, and then also to understand that some sense of anxiety or shame over this topic of sexuality is just what we're going to experience on this side of Genesis 3, I think then we can move forward in knowing, okay, I'm not going to do this perfectly, but by God's grace, I can have this conversation and all of the rest of them as well.
That's so good. And I think this also kind of moves over into some of the other aspects of things that can come up in conversation with our children related to sexuality and gender, because as you mentioned, everything from cartoons to some of the things that are now being taught very early in school deal a lot with sexual orientation, gender identity. What are some ways we can begin to protect our kids, or maybe educate's a better word, our children around these complexities within our world and help them to maintain a biblical view?
Yes, I really like the way that you set that question up, just talking about being proactive, because I think that's something that we need to think through, that a lot of times we wait until we're having to be reactive, like, oh, I'm not going to introduce my child to this until we see something. And being reactive is always so much more difficult because our emotions are involved and who knows what the situation is like, where, you just suggested that we should be proactive, and that's what we should be. And so I recommend, no matter what we're talking about in regards to sexuality or gender, that we think of like a little three-step sandwich. That first, we want to look at the base. The first level is, what did God design that is good? Then the second level is, how has sin corrupted the goodness of that design? And then the third level is, how does the gospel speak hope into this situation? So first, God's design, sin's corruption, the hope of the gospel. So let's take the topic of transgenderism, for example, or gender identity. What has God designed that is good? Well, in Genesis 1:27, we're told God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And so we know from scripture that God has designed us in his image as either male or female. And that is so good. So we're going to want to take our kids right to that verse and ask them, what truths are revealed in this passage? Oh, that God designed us in his image, and God designed us as either male or female. And then we can anchor it back to that conversation we had before about gender. And how do we figure out if we're male or female? Well, that's revealed by our bodies. It's not revealed by what colors we like, or by what sports we're good at or not good at, or by what music we like, or by how we feel on the inside. It's revealed by the truth of our bodies. And then say, that is God's design. And then we want to explain the corruption of sin. And we can say, because of sin, sometimes feelings trick us. And now this is not just feelings about gender. This is all sorts of feelings.
Yes.
Yes. And so you can ask your child, have you ever had a feeling that tricked you? And if they can't think of anything, you can be really vulnerable with them and say, well, do you remember last week when I asked you to clean your room and you didn't obey me? And then what did I do? I yelled and I screamed and I slammed the door. Now, as your mom, I did need to discipline you because you disobeyed, but I let my feelings of anger trick me into believing that yelling and screaming and slamming the door was the best thing, where that is not what I should have done because I wasn't treating you like you bear God's image. So I let my feelings of anger trick me. So you can talk about how feelings trick us because of sin, and then say sometimes the way someone's feelings might trick them is their body reveals that they're a boy and that God designed them as a boy. But because they like some things that more girls like, they might let their feelings trick them into believing that they're actually a girl, that they're not a boy. But that's just feelings tricking them because the truth is revealed by their body. Or you can say, or sometimes there might be a girl and her body reveals that God has designed her in his image as a girl, and that is good. But she might be good at some things that more boys are good at. And she lets her feelings trick her into believing that she's actually a boy, where the truth is that she's a girl. And so you just want to explain it that way, and then wrap it up with the hope of the gospel and say, but you know what? Jesus died for our sin and he rose again to new life. And so now everyone who turns from their sin and trusts in him is brought into a relationship with God. And one day when Jesus returns and he makes heaven and earth new, we are not going to struggle with sin tricking our feelings, that all of our feelings are going to match up with what God designed. So again, goodness of God's design, how sin has corrupted it, and then the hope of the gospel. Similarly, if you're wanting to introduce the concept of same-sex relationships, you want to think of, okay, at the base, what is the goodness here? And what has God designed that's good? It's marriage. And so you can take your kids right to scripture in Genesis chapter 2, where it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. And say, okay, marriage is one man and one woman becoming one flesh for life. Then you can hop over to Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul expounds on that and repeats, what Moses has written in Genesis 2. And then he says, this mystery is profound, but I am saying it refers to Christ and the church. And say, marriage is actually a picture of Jesus and the church. And so then you can explain how sin has corrupted this. And you can say, sometimes because of sin, people might desire the wrong kind of love in a relationship. And so you can explain that sometimes two men might desire to take what God designed to be friendship love and instead have it be the marriage kind of love. And you can say, okay, does this line up with what God's design is for marriage? No, marriage is one man and one woman becoming one flesh. It's not two men, and two men can't become one flesh in the way God designed. And then say, marriage is also a picture of Jesus in the church. Would two men be a picture of Jesus in the church? No. And then say, sometimes because of sin, two women might desire the wrong kind of love in a relationship. They might desire to take what God designed to be friendship love and instead have it be like marriage love. And then say, does this represent what God designed? No, marriage is one man and one woman. Two women can't become one flesh in the way God designed. And would this be a picture of Jesus in the church? No, it wouldn't be. And then wrap it up with the gospel and say, you know what? While we live in this fallen world, we're going to struggle with sin. And that means some people are going to struggle with the desire to take the wrong kind of love into a marriage relationship. Say, but you know what? When Jesus returns and he makes heaven and earth new, we are not going to desire the wrong kind of love in relationships. We are only going to desire what God has designed for us. So I think with that 3-step formula, we can explain these things easily to kids. And then obviously, a conversation with a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old, it's going to look different, but you're going to have that basis, that foundation upon which to grow these conversations.
Yes, and I think that's such a key part. And I actually see now why you named your organization what you did, because I think it's that foundational aspect that a lot of households are missing. As you mentioned, the children, they see it wherever they happen to see it, and now they're seeing it earlier and earlier in their TV, within the schools, and the foundation hasn't been laid oftentimes in a way where it's just very kind of direct in addressing some of these topics in a very direct and focused way. So even if they were in Sunday school all their life and they're hearing the love of Christ and they're hearing about grace and truth, they're not seeing specifically how it relates to some of these specific issues. And I know one of the things that Elizabeth's organization is, and I believe I'm getting the name correct, Foundations Worldview.
Mm-hmm,
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Foundations Worldview. She's the CEO and founder of this organization, which really focuses on helping children be able to critically think in a biblical way with all of these areas in our culture. So how can we continue to foster critical thinking within children? Because I find often when I'm talking to parents, and even like I said, my kids now are in college, that's a huge part of even getting jobs, being a great critical thinker. How could we help foster even that part of the mind of a child?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think one thing that's key that we often don't think of is asking questions. So a lot of times we'll give our kids a lot of information. And now there is a time to give information. When your child is 5 and they're about to run out into the middle of the road, you're not going to ask, is this a good option? You're just going to say, get back here so they don't get run over by a car. But I think when our children are walking through different situations in life, we need to ask questions, kind of like what I even just modeled with talking about same-sex relationships, rather than sitting down and lecturing them and saying, this is why this doesn't align with God's design, asking, so does this line up with what God has designed? How do you know? And so I think asking questions is really key. We want to get good at asking questions. And then something that's really important is I think a lot of times parents feel like they need to have the answer to every question. Now, having answers to our kids' question isn't a bad thing. However, if we have answers to every one of our kids' questions, what we're doing is we're training them to blindly accept whatever we have told them. And now, to a certain degree, that's not a bad thing. However, if that's all we do, what they're going to do is once they reach a point where they kind of don't care quite as much what we have to say, they're going to transfer that blind trust onto the next person who they most highly value, whether that's a peer, a teacher, a TikTok influencer, a college professor. And so rather than having an answer for every single one of our kids' questions, it's really valuable if at times we can say, that's a really great question. Why don't we work together to find the answer? And so actually walking our kids through the process of finding credible sources that are pointing you towards sound answers, that's so much more valuable than just training them to blindly trust what we say, setting them up to then blindly trust what someone else has to say. Now, I do have to give a fair warning that when we ask questions, when we train our kids to ask questions, and when we train them actually how to find answers, our kids are going to ask a lot more questions. And sometimes that's going to be really annoying. And there is a time to just be able to say, every once in a while, because I said so. You just have to do that because I said so. There is a time and place for that. However, I think if we can work through the pain of our children asking lots of different questions and not settling for easy answers, we can have the long game in mind and say, okay, this is really annoying in the here and now. However, I'm training my child to be a critical thinker, and they're not just going to blindly follow what somebody says because that person, is someone that they care about, or because that person is winsome, or because that person has a large social media following. So that's what I recommend, asking our kids questions, training them to ask good questions, and then walking them through the process of finding solid answers.
I think that's so good. We've been chatting with Elizabeth Urbanowicz about her new book, Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design, 40 questions and answers on sexuality and gender. And I want to make sure people know how to connect with you, Elizabeth, because you have lots of different resources that parents can use within your organization, as well as how they can get a copy of your book.
Yeah, so if you can remember the organization's names, if you remember Foundation Worldview, you can just go to foundationworldview.com and you can find all of our resources there. We have a whole host of things. We even have things like a book club where you can get titles recommended to you with worldview questions just to begin training your kids to think critically and biblically through everything they encounter.
Excellent. And we will link to your website as well as to your book on Amazon, as well as to your social media, because I saw that you also have pages for your organization. So we'll link there as well so people can stay up to date with everything that's going on with you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. It's been a joy to chat with you.
Until next time, everyone, live fully, love boldly, and rest intentionally. How can you keep your energy, happiness, creativity, and relationships fresh and thriving in the midst of never-ending family demands, career pressures, and the stress of everyday life? Learn about best-selling book Sacred Rest and discover the 7 types of rest you need most by visiting restquiz.com.